Wildfires in California the last few years have wreaked havoc with the state electricity system, and microgrids are being advanced as one of the potential solutions. And we're going to talk to Peter Asmus of Guidehouse Insights about microgrids. So welcome to the interview, Peter.
Nice to be here.
Let's start with a very basic question. What is a microgrid?
Well, a microgrid is like it sounds like. It's a small grid. And the idea, there's actually been microgrids operating for several decades, although most of those original microgrids were in parts of the world where there was no traditional grid. So in the US, it's Alaska, which is actually #1 state in the US because Alaska has some very limited transmission connecting cities. And so if you want electricity, probably the only way to do it is through a microgrid. So, and some of those early microgrids were mainly using diesel generators, which also people use for backup power. The change that's happened is that microgrids now, a lot of them use solar energy, batteries. In fact, you could have wind power, hydropower, biomass, and even electric vehicles are now sort of the latest thing where people are saying they could plug into microgrids. So what's happening is that microgrids can have cleaner energy resources, but in the lower 48, unlike Alaska where we have a grid, we've also seen more power outages, especially here in California where I'm based, but we just had this major event in Texas. We've had hurricanes on the East Coast, we have wildfires in Colorado, et cetera. So this is all building interest in having microgrids. The other shortcoming of just using a backup diesel generator is #1, diesel generators can be a dirty source of energy. 2, then you can only use them when the grid is down. So with a microgrid though, you can still get value out of it when the grid is also up and operating. So it's kind of more like it's a single system you can use all the time. You can be connected to the grid. You can disconnect from the grid. Utilities might even pay you to disconnect from the grid and serve as a demand response resource. And
Gotcha.
so that's, so they're versatile. They're versatile.
Right. Okay, so I can imagine a microgrid around a town in Alaska that's maybe isolated and it's not economic to get a traditional grid or connected to a traditional grid. But how big or how small can a microgrid be? Can it be a neighborhood? Can it be a city by itself? What about that?
Well, that's a good question. We, a few years ago, came up with the concept of a nanogrid, which we use more for like a single house. Some people might consider that a microgrid. Some people might not. But theoretically, a microgrid can be almost any size. A lot of them in, let's say, Africa we call them energy access, could be a few kilowatts, very small. The largest microgrid that I'm aware of is over 2,000 megawatts in size, serving some oil refinery operations in Saudi Arabia. So there's, most microgrids, though, I would say, sort of fall in the, let's say, 100 kilowatt up to 10 megawatt range, although in the US, there are some large campus systems like University of California, San Diego, which is I think it's about 40 megawatts or so. So, great diversity. Most people tend to focus more on sort of megawatt scale in terms of the US, around that number.
Gotcha. And is the primary benefit resiliency?
Yes, it is. I mean, you can get other benefits, but it's primarily resiliency, though also they can help integrate renewables, on-site renewables, not the big wind farms, big solar farms, etc. So the idea is they can also lower costs. So for example, if you had a microgrid and you knew at 4 o'clock in the afternoon that it was a peak power time and prices were high, you could self-generate as much as possible, just like people do with a solar system without a microgrid. You're kind of trying to lower your cost when prices are high and maybe buy back from the grid when prices are low, like in the middle of the night where there is no sun shining, etc. So they can serve multiple purposes, but the single largest driver is resiliency. And the reason why the US is the leading market in the world today for grid connected systems is because the reliability of our grid has been going down because of all these extreme weather events.
Gotcha. Is it possible, or is it usual, that microgrids exist in addition to the traditional power grid? You know, you're connected to both.
Yes, I mean, that's, you know, in industrialized economies. Globally, though, the number one segment are definitely what we call remote microgrids, which means there is no other grid or it's a weak grid. Like places of India, there is a grid, but it might operate 7 hours out of the day. So if you're running a business, you know, you're either going to have some sort of backup generator or you're going to have some form of a microgrid just to have that reliability. So that's important for most businesses.
And what are the regulatory hurdles that stand in the way of adopting more microgrids in the US?
Well, you know, you mentioned earlier neighborhoods. So I get this question all the time. You know, people want to say, well, why can't my community just create a microgrid? Your community could create a microgrid, but the existing utility would have to be involved, because right now there are a lot of prohibitions which basically date back to the utility monopoly structure that we're kind of in this transition from the old way of doing things where bigger was better, you know, sort of big, large power plants, you're connected to a grid. And now what we're seeing, our forecasts show that beginning this year, there's more distributed energy resources coming online across the world than centralized generation. So that's like nuclear plants, coal plants. So there's more small stuff in aggregate coming online, and that trend only accelerates. So we're going to have to use things like microgrids to kind of help organize that. So otherwise it's just going to become unmanageable. All these small little systems, how do you orchestrate them in some way? And so microgrids are one way to do that. So in terms of barriers, one is a lot of the rules say you can't transfer. So if you had a solar system and your neighbor wanted to have the power, you cannot give that power to him if he's on like the street, or they call it the over the fence rule, even serving directly your neighbor. So those are a lot of rules. So to build a community microgrid today, you're going to have the utility involved, and more utilities are becoming interested in microgrids. The other main issue is resiliency. There is no value for resiliency. So the irony is you're building a microgrid, but the primary service you're providing, the market doesn't say that's worth X amount of dollars. And that's why we're also seeing that commercial and industrial customers are now the fastest growing market, because there's no public value, but they know what it costs them. Like if you were in California and you had, let's say in 2019, 3 PSPS events, public service, public safety shutdown, each 3 days long, you're saying, hey, I lost 500 grand or whatever you may have lost, then you know what that value is. And so you can kind of figure, well, this is worthwhile for me if these power outages are going to continue at a similar rate. So that's, so it's kind of like there's no value for resiliency. And then there's just a lot of regulations that sort of date back to the utility monopoly. And of course, in the US, we have deregulated markets, we have vertically integrated markets, we have hybrid markets. So each market is going to have kind of a slightly different blend of barriers and as well as drivers.
But Peter, I've interviewed a number of utility executives and economists who suggest that the DERs, the distributed energy resources, are re-engineering the utility model, the power system model, and we're going to this idea of a platform where everybody can buy and sell to each other. And one executive said, think of it as a collection, a big collection of microgrids, all working in a web, in a network that can all speak to each other through these new technologies that are coming along. What's your take on that?
Well, I think that's the vision of the future. It sounds a little too good to be true, like a lot of this stuff, and it all gets hyped. Like artificial intelligence is another one of those terms that is going to help make all this happen. Now there is a reality there, but it's not like it's magic either. So what you're talking about is another concept I write a lot about, is the virtual power plant concept. So, that's this idea where you might not necessarily have a microgrid, but you might have 1,000 homes that all have solar storage, maybe even some have EVs, and they all get the benefit for the individual home, but you're also part of this larger group, like this aggregation that a software vendor comes in, and when there's a shortage on the grid, let's say the grid says we need 10 megawatts in 1 hour, they can get those market signals and they can orchestrate those resources. You could do the same with microgrids. In Denmark, there was a project that did exactly that, all these different microgrids, and then they were organized by the transmission system operator, and so that they could kind of see, like in Denmark, there's a lot of wind. So when the wind was dying down, there was a lot of combined heat and power plants that could kind of fill in that gap. So I do think that's the wave of the future. We call it the energy cloud, as sort of like this umbrella where, mobility and energy is coming together. We're seeing more EVs. And so of course, if the grid starts going down and people have electric vehicles, then that's going to impact your transportation. So you're going to have more resiliency in the grid for that reason. So it's, I think it's one of the most exciting times, but there is a lot of uncertainty and there's a certain amount of risk. And the utilities are the ones who, feel somewhat threatened by this, but then some of them no longer want to put their head in the sand. They're dipping their toe in the microgrid arena, and more utilities are getting involved. And I think that'll be the interesting part is, they don't have all the technologies though to run a microgrid. So they're going to have to partner, and they're going to partner not just with private sector, but with public sector, with communities and all that. And so we're kind of right in the middle of that evolution.
It sounds like, and final question, Peter, this has been a fascinating discussion, but is it fair to say that during the 2020s, so the decade we're in now, we're going to see a period of intense disruption and innovation and change within the utility models and the American electrical system?
Oh, I would say that's definitely the case, but it's going to proceed at different rates throughout the country, because we just heard about Texas. So Texas is kind of an island to itself. And that was what a lot of people are talking about, to avoid federal regulation. But we also saw the shortcoming of that, like, when they ran out of power, they couldn't import enough power from other states. And so that's kind of the big grid. But, what we're talking about here is more of these microgrids, distributed energy resources, and, even with electric vehicles. The hottest topic right now with our firm is electric vehicles, clean mobility, but also those electric vehicles serving as a backup to your house. You've got a battery in the car. So that's also like, hey, in an extreme emergency, and in Texas, there was some example of people with pickups, they actually powered up certain devices through their cars. And I think we're going to just see more and more of that, and even smart buildings, that's all related to this. Buildings are part of microgrids. And so you're going to have more innovation happening there. And then the other trend we see is this concept of energy as a service, where these products can be offered with no capital costs up front to the client, like what happened with solar, rooftop solar. People are now doing that with microgrids, because a lot of people say, well, that sounds complicated. How do I decide who I go with? Well, if you give a vendor, they own it, they operate it, they get paid, they make more money, the better it performs. That's sort of a win-win. And so I see that as also another trend in this industry.
Peter, thank you very much. Very insightful. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.